Hey, welcome back to the channel. It's time for another one, this time the Red Bull Racing RB16B. And the fact they've called it the RB16B tells you quite a lot about how it's very much a carryover from the RB16 that left off in 2020. And why not? By the end of 2020, that was a strong car, a contender, a car that won the last time we raced in Formula One. So why not carry over huge chunks of it? This might actually be one of Red Bull's best opportunities in 2021 because so often we see them bring out a brand new car and yet struggle with it in the early part of the season whilst they're getting to grips with the various new concepts that that new car might employ. Well, carrying over a car that they know incredibly well, that they know is reliable, that they've figured out many of the weaknesses that hampered them early in 2020 could be a great basis for a tight championship battle in 2021. Some of the biggest differences visually on this car are actually just in the stickers that are applied to it. The fact that Honda has replaced Aston Martin on the rear wing, the fact that Sergio Perez's name will replace that of Alex Albon, and along with Sergio Perez comes a number of his own personal sponsors that now have joined the team as well in 2021. But of course we're not interested in the livery on this channel, we're interested in the technical side. So let's look at what we can see from the differences between 2020's RB16 and the 2021 RB16B. Starting off at the front end then, there is lots that's very familiar to us. The nose cone, very similar slimline shape. The chassis, as you can see, follows in, contours in, slims down before it gets to this long, slim nose with the now familiar Adrian Newey nostril on the front. That's all doing a very similar job to the way that it was done previously on the RB16. What has definitely changed at this front end is this cape. Now, first thing to say is that cape is very, very different to that of the Alfa Romeo C41 that I described in an earlier video, where that cape on the Alfa comes all the way up to the nose tip, trying to gather that airflow up much earlier in the process than the Red Bull and shovel it underneath the front of the floor. With Red Bull, they're doing something different. Still quite some way back down here, but they have reprofiled this cape. It's a much more aggressive upturned shape than previously on last year's car. It works very well with the high rake concept that Red Bull have become so familiar with. When the car's sat up at an angle, by increasing the angle or the intake angle, if you like, at the front end of this cape, you still get to capture an awful lot of that airflow coming off the underside of the nose, coming off these front wing pillars and diverting it, channeling it all into this critical area at the front of the floor. I've talked in other videos about how this year, perhaps even more so than in previous years, getting flow into the underside of the floor in a controlled manner, in a high speed, low pressure controlled manner, is a really important part of recapturing some of the downforce or some of the performance that's been lost in the regulation changes that have trimmed in the rear ends of the floor, dropped the height of the diffuser strakes, and some of the changes around rear brake ducts as well. A lot of that designed to slow the cars down, so the teams now have to find new ways to get more effectiveness out of that critical part, the rear of the car, the diffuser, that sloped section right underneath the gearbox and underneath the rear wing that generates so much downforce on a Formula One car. By losing some of that in regulation, they've had to find new areas that they can work on to manipulate the airflow to get more flow into that and then more downforce effectively out of it. This is one of those things. By tweaking some of the details, and this car is all about details, there aren't very many major, hugely visual changes that we can see. So it is really about the tiny little differences they've managed to make. But that's what Red Bull have been very strong at. If you think about last year, when they started the season with a difficult car, part of the difficulty was getting some of the vortices that are started around this area, the Y250 vortex that spins up off these little inboard wingtips, combining to make a very powerful vortex that channels then through this section, through the barge boards and off towards the rear of the car. Part of what they struggled with last year was that worked incredibly well at high speed. The high rate concept is a temperamental concept. It's a concept that, in theory, can produce more downforce than the flatter rake cars like the Mercedes and others that have now followed suit with them, but it's temperamental. It's not easy to get that to work at all different situations around a lap or around a Grand Prix, at different speeds, at different attitudes that the car's sitting at. Because the angle of the car changes and the flow coming off those wingtips, for example, changes at different velocities, the power of the vortices that coming off those also change. And at slow speed, what Red Bull struggled with in the early part of last year was losing control of some of these vortices coming off here or around the front of the nose cone pillars. Picking those up with the next section, which is the cape and then the barge boards, was really a problem in some corners, particularly slow corners. When they lose control of those, they effectively lose a huge portion of their downforce in the slower speed stuff. And so the car worked at some circuits, but not at others. Over the course of the year though, they tweaked tiny details, and it really was tiny things that from a distance you really struggle to notice, but in their wind tunnel, through their CFD, the computational fluid dynamics programs where they're able to monitor this stuff in finite detail, they were able to tweak some of those tiny little design elements to recapture some of that, to regain control of some of those vortices spinning up off the front, to channel them in a more controlled way, keep them under their control. And therefore, they were able to even the performance of the car out across more and more different types of circuit. That's why they finished the season so strongly. That knowledge, that understanding, will all transfer over to the R16B because so much of it is the same. So by just changing a few tiny details further from where they finished off the end of last season, hopefully they'll have even more control of those things. They'll have even more understanding of how those tiny little complex vortices work, and therefore we'll be able to get the best out of the car at all circuits right from the beginning of the season. That will indeed be their plan. The front wing looks very, very similar, very different to that of the Alfa Romeo on the video I did prior to this one. You can see a very different concept in the way they're producing downforce. Elements towards the outboard section of the wing still producing downforce, whereas on the Alfa, the front wing tapers way down to a very, very low section here, where they're only generating downforce on the inboard sections, allowing the outboard area to just funnel the airflow off and out through this gap between the outturned rear trailing edge of the end plate and the front tyre to help drag away the messy turbulence from around that turning front tyre, as I've described in other videos as well. Red Bull going for a slightly different idea around downforce producing. So this, in theory, a much bigger area, surface area to produce downforce, and at the high rake that they run this, they rely on that heavily to control the front end of the car. With the extremely high rake that Red Bull run, with the back end of the car jacked up to such an angle, the knock-on effect of that is that the leading edge of the front wing, in the same way, tips downwards because it's pivoting around the front axle, around the contact patch, the front tyres. Everything ahead of that effectively is lowered. That means you get a front wing that comes closer to the ground and starts to generate what we call ground effect, maximising the low pressure zone underneath that front wing, because it's a little bit like the way the front of the floor does. Because it's squashed so close to the floor, it squeezes the airflow through a tiny gap as that wing lowers. Therefore it accelerates it. When it accelerates the airflow, it lowers the pressure, and that low pressure zone is what helps to generate downforce as the ambient pressure, or the higher pressure above, wants to try and force its way down to the low pressure zone. That's a concept that Red Bull have been working on perfecting over many, many years, and are streaks ahead of many other teams in this area. But as I said before, it is one of those difficult to get right concepts, because as the car bumps around the circuit, as it leaps over curbs through corners, of course the gap between the front wing leading edge and the floor, a gap that they are relying on to produce that low pressure zone and therefore downforce, opens and closes quite dramatically around certain parts of the lap, and therefore their downforce level at that front end is no longer constant. As the gap opens and closes, they start to fluctuate in terms of the amount of downforce, the amount of low pressure underneath that wing that it starts to create. That's one of the downsides, or one of the pitfalls, of running an extreme high rate car. Of course, the plus side of all that is if you get it right, by maximising the rear end and lowering the front, you do squeeze a lot of airflow through this narrow channel at the front wing and at the leading edge of the floor, lowering that pressure massively, allowing it to expand as the car raises up towards the rear end, pulling it through the diffuser, causing or generating huge amounts of downforce using that method. It's just that it's temperamental. Looking at this sort of front quarter angle, there are some obvious changes to things like the barge boards, which I expect pretty much every team to maximise wherever they can. A lot of people have asked me about the token system. What does it mean? What's free and what's not free to change over the course of 2021? In the most simple terms, the aero surfaces are all free. That development of aerodynamic surfaces is unrestricted. So you're only restricted by the amount you want to spend, the amount you want to commit to this particular car within the cost cap, obviously in 2021, but over and above what you're willing to divert away into the 2022 car, which is a huge change on the horizon and something which will take a huge part of everyone's resources from a very early stage in the season. However, these areas here around the barge boards, around the leading edge of the floor, right underneath the front of the chassis, around this area here, are all going to be areas that are having to be developed heavily and worked hard to try and recapture some of the loss from this now mandated cutout at the rear end of the floor itself, an area that used to be really critical in sealing the underside of the floor and maximising the diffuser's potential. Now they're having to look at other ways to try and do that. As I said before, this will be one of them. The barge boards on the launch pics here look a little bit more Mercedes-like, a little bit that sort of Venetian blind style barge board that we've seen on the Mercedes over recent years. Again, something that I'm sure will morph a number of times before we actually see it at the first race. The car hits the racetrack tomorrow at Silverstone for the very first time, with both Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez for the first time on board, and maybe even at that stage we'll start to see more updates being brought to the car ahead of the first test in Bahrain. Down at the rear end there have been more changes. Now this is where Red Bull have spent their development tokens that they're allowed. So the development tokens, you have 2 of them at this stage of the year, can be spent on something that's homologated, a homologated part, like a chassis, like a gearbox, like a crash structure or nose cone. Those are the things where development tokens need to be spent. Now we know that McLaren have had to spend their development tokens on the chassis just to accommodate that new Mercedes engine, whereas other teams can spend them on generating outright performance. That's what Red Bull have done. A brand new transmission, a brand new gearbox in the back of here. Not something we can necessarily see, but what we can see is that only just about, because they've very much darkened the pictures around this area to hide some of the developments they've made. But when you see the 2 cars side to side, which I'll show you in a moment, you definitely see that the underside of the Coke bottle, the area that goes in around the gearbox, is definitely slimmer, which will have been the very intention trying to spend tokens on a brand new gearbox. Will almost all have been in aerodynamic terms, trying to slim it down, repackage it to shrink the bodywork around it more and get as much flow through this section as possible, again, to maximise the power of that diffuser. The more flow we can get into this section and out over the back of the diffuser, it helps to pull more flow through the diffuser, and that helps to suck the car down onto the racetrack, generating downforce. So it looks like a lot of work done inside there that we can't really get eyes on yet, but that will have also had a knock-on effect to rear suspension, which will have changed. It does look like there's some bracketry change to the top of the wishbone compared to last year. Can't quite see exactly what that is, but often in those situations it's about creating more of a gap between the upper and lower wishbones, trying to extend that top wishbone to create a clear path for the flow to pass through uninterrupted for the reasons that I just touched on. The pictures that they've released have a single rear wing pillar, central rear wing pillar, and seemingly, although it is quite hard to tell, they've only released 2 images at this stage. It looks like they may have done away with the turbo wastegate pipe. A new regulation for this year allows that, and what Honda have done, given that they're exiting the sport, officially at least at the end of 2021, they have brought forward their 2022 engine, the engine that they pinned so much hope on. They've brought that forward to allow Red Bull to use it in 2021. 2 ways that could go. One, you could say, well, they've been rushed into doing this. Now we know when McLaren rushed Honda into entering the sport earlier than they had originally planned, it didn't end well. But look, this is a relationship that's much more advanced than that. It's already well established, and the performance that they were getting out of that Honda engine last year was already at a great baseline. So if they've managed to add to that, to bring some extra performance, Red Bull could be in a great situation here. So central wing pillar, seemingly at least from these angles, no turbo wastegate pipe around the exhaust, which other teams have. The rest of that rear end and rear wing very similar, but what has happened here is partly because of that new gearbox, the bodywork around the rear end definitely shrunk in. From an aerodynamic perspective, that is Adrian Newey's holy grail. Red Bull have found ways to shrink that in and reprofile the contours of the rear end, which you have to assume will be an advantage aerodynamically. There are a couple of changes around here. This section here that just comes off the back of the halo, also slightly different to last year, which might give a little bit more channeling of the airflow from around the driver's head down these sections, these new reprofiled sections, and again down towards the rear of the car. So a number of really interesting details, many of which we can't see yet because they haven't yet released any more than 2 images of the car. But from what we can see, they've certainly been busy, and given where they left off in 2020, this could be something quite exciting for 2021. Perhaps the first opportunity in a while we might see Red Bull hit the ground running.